the day after humiliating a soldier. He saw her face on the news and couldn't believe what he'd done. The sun was setting over Denver International Airport as passengers rushed to board their flights, eager to get home. Among them was a woman in uniform, her combat boots steady, her posture upright, and her expression calm yet focused. She carried herself with the kind of confidence earned through experience. But there was a subtle weariness in her eyes, the kind that came from long days away from home. Staff Sergeant Evelyn Carter, a decorated U.S. Army medic, had just returned from a grueling deployment overseas. Tonight, all she wanted was to sit in her seat, close her eyes, and imagine the joy of finally embracing her family after months apart. Evelyn stepped onto the plane, her uniform drawing a few glances. Some passengers nodded in respect, but others simply looked away. It didn't bother her. She was used to being overlooked. What Evelyn didn't expect, though, was the man seated just a row behind her. From the moment she passed him, his eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. She could feel his judgment as she stowed her bag and settled into her seat. He was the kind of man who didn't whisper his opinions, and soon the entire cabin would learn that in the most uncomfortable way. As the plane began to fill, Evelyn reached for the small photo tucked inside her jacket pocket, a snapshot of her son and daughter smiling at a 4th of July picnic. That image was her anchor, the thing that kept her grounded no matter how far she went. But her quiet moment was interrupted by a voice, sharp, loud, and full of disdain. "Figures," the man scoffed loudly, his voice cutting through the cabin chatter. "Of course, they'll let just anyone wear the uniform these days." Evelyn didn't react. She kept her eyes on the photo, inhaling deeply through her nose. But the man wasn't done. "I don't even know why they bother. What's she doing? Handing out band-aids? Bet she's never seen real action." Evelyn had seen more than action. She'd saved lives, faced horrors unimaginable, and stood where most wouldn't dare. For now, though, she chose silence. The murmurs in the cabin quieted as passengers turned their attention toward the man's voice. A few exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Evelyn sat still, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo in her hand. She had faced worse than words, far worse. And yet, something about this moment, the blatant disrespect, settled uncomfortably in her chest. The man leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying the attention. He was in his late 40s, dressed casually in a polo shirt and khakis, his expression smug. "You know," he continued, as if addressing the entire cabin, "real soldiers, the ones who do the heavy lifting, don't need a parade just for showing up. It's all for show these days." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. The woman beside her, a young mother with a toddler on her lap, whispered softly, "Are you okay?" Evelyn nodded, offering a faint smile. She didn't need to defend herself to a stranger. Her actions, her sacrifices, spoke louder than any words could. But the man wasn't finished. "Bet she's never even left a base," he muttered, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One older gentleman seated across the aisle leaned forward and opened his mouth to speak, but his wife tugged on his sleeve. Shaking her head, "Don't," she whispered. "It'll just make things worse." Evelyn remained silent. She'd been trained to assess situations, to determine when action was necessary and when restraint was the wiser choice. This was the latter. Still, she couldn't help but wonder why. Why did this man feel so entitled to tear her down without knowing a single thing about her? Was it the uniform, her gender, her skin, or just his own insecurities spilling out in the worst possible way? The flight attendant, a petite woman with a warm but tired smile, walked briskly down the aisle. She paused near Evelyn's row, her eyes darting between the soldier and the man. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone professional but firm. "Oh, everything's fine," the man said with a mocking grin. "Just making an observation. Hope I'm not offending anyone's delicate feelings." The flight attendant's jaw tightened, but she simply nodded and moved on, clearly aware of the growing tension but unsure how to diffuse it. Evelyn let out a slow breath. She had dealt with men like this before, the kind who would test boundaries just to see how far they could go. As the plane began to taxi, Evelyn closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat. The man's words continued to ring out sporadically during the flight, each one dripping with condescension. Yet Evelyn remained still, her silence speaking volumes. She knew who she was, what she had done, and what she was capable of. The man's words might sting, but they could never define her. But something else lingered in the air, a quiet tension among the other passengers. The man's comments may have been directed at her, but everyone around her felt the weight of them. As the plane soared through the sky, Evelyn's thoughts drifted far from the cabin, far from the man and his ignorance. Her mind took her back to the scorching desert heat of Iraq, where every day was a test of endurance and courage. She had been a combat medic for nearly a decade, her job not just to heal, but to make split-second decisions that often determined who lived and who didn't. There was one day in particular that always stayed with her. She had been part of a convoy delivering medical supplies to a remote village. The route was dangerous, littered with the remnants of past conflicts. She remembered the sudden blast, the deafening roar of an IED exploding just ahead of her vehicle. In the chaos that followed, she had to spring into action, pulling injured soldiers from burning wreckage while under enemy fire. Her hands were steady, her focus unshakable, even as her own safety was in jeopardy. Evelyn didn't do it for recognition. She didn't care about medals or ceremonies. For her, it was about the people she served alongside, their faces, their lives. She remembered the young soldier she saved that day, a 19-year-old who had just written home to his mother the night before. His leg was shattered, his face pale from the blood loss. But he survived because Evelyn refused to give up. And it wasn't just the soldiers. Evelyn had spent countless hours treating villagers caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. She remembered a little girl, no older than 7, who had been injured in a mortar attack. Evelyn carried her to safety, singing softly to calm her until help arrived. That girl's smile, despite the pain she endured, was something Evelyn would never forget. These were the moments that defined her. Not the uniform, not the rank, but the lives she touched. Yet she had also faced battles beyond the battlefield. There were times when her competence was questioned, not because of her skills, but because of her gender and the color of her skin. She had endured snide comments from fellow soldiers and superiors who doubted her abilities. But each time, she proved them wrong. She rose above, letting her actions speak louder than their prejudice ever could. Back in the plane, Evelyn opened her eyes, the memories still vivid. She glanced at the man a row behind her, who was now flipping through a magazine, seemingly content with his earlier remarks. She didn't hate him. Evelyn had long since learned that hatred was a heavy burden to carry. Instead, she felt a quiet resolve. This man didn't know her story, and he likely never would. But his ignorance would never overshadow the truth of who she was. But the universe has a way of bringing truths to light, sometimes in ways no one expects. And for Evelyn, the next day would prove just that. The next morning, Marcus Taylor sat in his living room in San Antonio, sipping his coffee as sunlight filtered through the blinds. His routine was predictable: breakfast, scrolling through his phone, and catching the morning news on Channel 5. He flipped on the television, the volume humming to life as the anchor began a segment with a tone of solemn reverence. "This morning, we honor a true American hero," the anchor announced. Staff Sergeant Evelyn Carter, a combat medic who risked her life to save not only her fellow soldiers but countless civilians during her deployment overseas. Marcus froze, his coffee cup hovering midair. The screen showed a photo of a woman in uniform, her expression calm, her presence commanding. His chest tightened. It was her, the woman from the plane. The report continued, recounting the harrowing details of her service. They spoke of the ambush on the convoy, how Evelyn had braved gunfire to rescue the wounded, dragging them to safety with shrapnel tearing through her own leg. They described her tireless efforts in remote villages, providing aid to innocent families trapped in the chaos of war. One of the villagers interviewed in the segment spoke through a translator. "She saved my daughter. If not for her, we would have lost everything. She has a heart of gold." Marcus's stomach churned. He set his coffee down, his hands trembling slightly. The anchor went on to describe Evelyn's numerous commendations, including a bronze star for her extraordinary bravery. This is the kind of heroism that often goes unnoticed, the anchor concluded. Today, we shine a light on the incredible sacrifices made by those who serve, especially those like Staff Sergeant Carter, who embody the true spirit of compassion and courage. Marcus couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. The woman he had insulted, belittled, and disrespected on the plane was nothing short of a hero. His words from the previous day echoed in his mind, sharp, hateful, and cruel. He remembered the calm in her eyes, the way she sat silently as he mocked her. She didn't defend herself, didn't lash out. She didn't have to. Her actions spoke louder than anything he could ever say. Marcus sank into his chair, a wave of shame crashing over him. He had spent years believing he understood the world, that his perspective was the only one that mattered. But now he was confronted with the undeniable truth. He had been so very wrong. But guilt is a heavy thing, and as it settled into Marcus's chest, he couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to make things right, or if he'd have to live with the weight of his actions forever. Marcus spent the rest of the morning in a daze, replaying the events of the flight over and over in his mind. The pride in his voice as he mocked her, the quiet dignity with which she endured his words. It all felt like a cruel twist of fate now. He could almost see the expression on her face as she sat there, unmoved, taking in his hatred without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. The shame was unbearable. He paced his small living room, his thoughts spiraling. Evelyn Carter had not only survived unimaginable situations, but had also carried herself with honor and grace, even when faced with men like him. And what had he done? He had torn her down in public, for no reason other than his own ignorance. Marcus found himself searching her name online, devouring every article he could find. He read about the missions she had been a part of, the lives she had saved, and the sacrifices she had made for her family and her country. Her story was extraordinary, and yet she had never demanded recognition. She simply did what needed to be done. But the more he read, the heavier the guilt became. His actions on the plane weren't just a moment of poor judgment. They were a reflection of something deeper, something uglier that he hadn't been ready to confront. For years, he had clung to biases and assumptions, viewing the world through a narrow, self-serving lens. Evelyn's story had shattered that illusion, leaving him face to face with the truth. Marcus knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused. His words had already been spoken, his actions witnessed by an entire cabin of passengers, but he felt compelled to try, even if it was just for his own conscience. He thought about reaching out to the airline to leave a message for Evelyn. But what could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" felt so small, so inadequate. Instead, he decided to act. Marcus donated to a veterans organization that provided support for soldiers returning from deployment. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was a start. He also wrote a letter to Evelyn, pouring out his apology in raw, unfiltered honesty. He explained that he had seen the news, that her story had opened his eyes, and that he was deeply, profoundly sorry for his behavior. He ended the letter with these words: "You didn't deserve my hate. You deserved my respect, and I failed to give it to you. I will carry the weight of that failure for the rest of my life, but I promise to do better. Thank you for your service, for your bravery, and for being a better person than I ever was." Marcus didn't know if the letter would ever reach her, but writing it felt like a step toward accountability. It wasn't about easing his guilt. It was about acknowledging the harm he had caused and committing to change. But sometimes, the most profound lessons come not from grand gestures, but from quiet moments of reflection. And Marcus's journey to understanding was only just beginning. A week later, Marcus sat in the same chair in his living room, staring out the window. He didn't know if Evelyn had ever received his letter or if she ever would, but something had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own ignorance and the realization that it wasn't enough to feel guilty. Change required action. It required looking beyond surface judgments and truly seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. He turned off the television and sat in the silence, thinking about Evelyn. She had taught him something he hadn't been willing to learn on his own. Everyone has a story, and some of those stories carry burdens heavier than most people could ever imagine. The least you can do is offer respect, even when you don't understand. Especially then. Marcus wasn't a hero, and he never would be, but he hoped, in his small way, to start living his life with the kind of courage Evelyn had shown every day. Not the courage to endure a battlefield, but the courage to confront his own flaws and strive to be better. As viewers, we often hear stories about heroes like Evelyn and think of them as distant, untouchable figures, but they walk among us every day, on flights, in grocery stores, in our neighborhoods, and sometimes we don't even realize their significance until it's too late. So let this story be a reminder. The next time you're about to judge someone based on a fleeting impression, pause, think, and remember, everyone has a story, even if you don't see it right away. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on how you treat the people around you. Let's strive to lead with kindness, understanding, and respect. And if you believe in sharing messages like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Because sometimes, it's the stories we don't know that teach us the most.